All right, good morning. It's nice to be here and to talk about an issue that's been really important, well, globally, but also important to me for many years. This session should go well. Scott and I think, are on the same page. My talk will lead nicely into his. And we'll get to this broad issue of how are antibiotics used in animal agriculture? How do these present a potential risk, both to animal health and human health? What's being done globally, so in various countries? I'll touch on some of that in my talk with respect to how we use antibiotics and the question of, well, if there's any risk at all, why do we continue to do it? Are there any benefits to using antibiotics in animal agriculture? And I think that sums up these two presentations. We'll have time at the end, I think, for some question and answer. Let me just start with just what are antibiotics? Because it's amazing to me how the general public just fails to recognize what antibiotics actually are. These are simply these low molecular weight compounds, just a simple compound that kill or inhibit the growth of microorganisms. Oh, okay, so we humans made them, right? No, absolutely not. Antibiotics were originally and are naturally produced by bacteria and fungi in the environment. And still, that fact is so important to how we assess the relationship between antibiotics and resistance to antibiotics because of the fact that many antibiotics are naturally produced and exist in the environment regardless of what humans do, that it makes it incredibly difficult to attribute resistance, as we will talk about, to a specific antibiotic administration. Again, antibiotics exist in the environment naturally. What we have done is tweaked their structure so that they function a little bit better, they have longer lasting action, they may target some bacteria more specifically. But again, we can't forget that the original antibiotics are naturally produced by organisms in the environment. Why? What benefit is it to a microorganism to actually produce a compound that might kill its neighbors? So that's where we get to the dogma for decades was that it's germ warfare. It's competition. One bacterium wants to survive, and the only way it's going to do that is to kill off its neighbor. And that's how we've used antibiotics as well. We need to kill, kill, kill. There's a pathogen in that host, administer the antibiotic, and try to kill off that pathogen. But that's actually not currently the thought about how antibiotics work in the environment. So the naturally produced kind that are produced by some organisms in these environments. And the reason we now have changed is because if you measure the amount of antibiotic in the environment, these levels are incredibly low. They're so low that they really wouldn't kill their neighbors. So what is it that they're doing? They're probably being used as a form of communication between bacteria, between organisms in the environment. They tell each other that, oh, there's something that's changing in our environment. They release some compound, and it notifies the neighbors that if they work together, they can actually survive whatever insult is in the environment. We call them antibiotics, but the fact is that that's the name we gave them. These compounds exist independent of anything we've done and probably are there just as communication among bacterium. Then we pump in levels at much higher levels to try to kill off the bacteria that we want to kill. And we're going to talk about what the consequences are of doing something like that. How do we then use these antibiotics, whether they are the original naturally produced variety or the synthetic analogs that we've created? There are 4 approval categories in the United States. This is by the FDA, Center for Veterinary Medicine. One label would be the growth promotion feed efficiency. This is a very low dose. It is often administered in the feed, and it's meant to improve the health of the animal. This is obviously the one that gets the most news, attacked the most, because these levels are low, and so they often are called non-therapeutic, subtherapeutic, something that implies that they don't actually work. But I think most of us know that they do work, and that's why we continue to use them. So it's important that we get our terminology straight, and for some of us, we just find those terms offensive, the non-therapeutic definition. So we've got growth promotion feed efficiency. We've got disease prevention. Okay, so this would be an administration when you know that the disease is likely to present itself, it just hasn't shown up yet. So technically you are treating healthy animals, but these are animals that are at risk. Okay, so you're trying to prevent the disease. Respiratory disease would be a classic example. Or diarrheic illness. You know the diarrhea is going to come at this specific point in the production, and so you administer the antibiotic as a prevention dose. Disease control might be a situation where someone in the herd, some animal has broken with disease, and now you're trying to control the spread. So you're using these antibiotics at a little bit higher level, and again, it's to control the disease before it has a chance to really spread throughout the herd. And treatment is the high-dose antibiotic that's given to a single individual, usually, when that individual is diseased. Now, you could have a situation where the entire herd or flock is diseased, and you administer at that high dose. But these two doses, the disease control, whoops, here we go. I guess I got to decide which one to point at here. Yeah, it'll be right in your eyes if it goes over the top. So these control and treatment doses are the higher doses, tend to be the ones that aren't being attacked in the media, but as I'm going to show, many of the papers that get cited for the harm that antibiotic administration in animals is doing to public health are actually based on treatment and control doses. So the public and the people who want to ban antibiotics in animal agriculture, I think, are fairly confused about what the issue actually is. There are various bills that are working through the House and the Senate. My guess at this point is that they are completely stalled with the change in the House. One would be this PAMTA, the Preservation of Antibiotics for Medical Treatment Act. In it, there are some useful pieces, like how we might do surveillance for changes in antimicrobial resistance. The fact is that this bill would likely eliminate at least 2 of the approval claims, if not 3. It would definitely eliminate growth promotion feed efficiency uses. It would definitely eliminate disease prevention uses, and the disease control part is questionable based on the wording. No one seems to really be clear on what the bill would actually do as its impact. So we are aware, very aware, that there are efforts to legislate how we use antibiotics in animal agriculture. Well, let's just start with a schematic of what is the antibiotic actually doing when you give it to an individual animal, or if you administer it at the herd level. These are schematics that come out of a paper by Mark Lipsitch, and I want to show you that, again, the dogma that is present, that has been around for decades, this idea of attack, germ warfare idea, doesn't serve us well, and I'll show why. Let's say that this big circle is the host. It could be a pig, it could be a human. The little green circles inside represent susceptible bacteria. Bacteria that are infecting this host, but they are susceptible to the action of the antibiotic. You give the antibiotic to that host, you will kill off those bacteria. But under the case where you end up with a treatment failure, resistant bacteria develop. That would be an example of a treatment failure. You kill off the susceptibles, but some bacterium in that host mutates and becomes resistant, the red circles. That would be a classic definition of a treatment failure. That's what we're concerned about, perhaps, when we use antibiotics. And now that individual who's harboring resistant bacteria can spread them to other individuals in the herd, other individuals in the community. And that's the fear piece that comes into play. This dogma, this idea of how antibiotics are administered, resistance develops, comes to us with respect to tuberculosis. That is the classic disease that a lot of these idea of how we should use antibiotics is based. If you want to prevent resistant TB from emerging, you give as much antibiotic as you can, as quickly as you can, because then you will prevent resistant mutants of Mycobacterium tuberculosis from emerging. The way that we use antibiotics, the way we're taught to use antibiotics, is based on the assumption of tuberculosis. If you give the antibiotic in high doses quickly, you'll prevent the emergence of resistance. Okay? That's an important piece, because most of the diseases we face today, most of the bacteria we're trying to kill, do not fit the tuberculosis model. Let's think of a couple that are relevant from a human health perspective, and often there's some blame that comes back to animal agriculture. Vancomycin-resistant enterococci, clearly a problem in the hospitals, the VREs, but we are often told that there's a link to animal agriculture as well. Methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, the MRSAs. This will come up a little bit later in my talk. Again, the thought is maybe there's some link to animal agriculture. We should change how we use antibiotics because antibiotic use in animal agriculture is causing the emergence of these resistant strains. And the thought is it's the low doses that are causing it. Why? Because of the TB model. We're giving these doses at too low of levels. We're allowing the resistant strains to emerge. There's a huge problem here. These two examples do not represent the emergence of a mutant strain, a genetic mutational event. That's not what's happening. I don't want to go too much into bacterial genetics today. That's not the point. But what's happening is there are genes within this bacterium, or these two bacteria, that give resistance to that strain. It's not created de novo because you gave an antibiotic. It's a gene that's present and can be spread from strain to strain, perhaps. So the use of an antibiotic on one farm is not creating these mutants that are resistant to antibiotics. It's maybe allowing for the spread. That's a very different approach and argument to how we use antibiotics than, again, that TB model. Let me go back. Another piece is that TB is a pathogen no matter who gets it. If you're infected with tuberculosis, you are infected with a pathogen that needs to be treated. But everybody is colonized with Enterococcus, and everybody has Staph aureus, most likely, sometime, if not all the time, and they don't cause disease. They only cause disease when there's something else going on in your body that gives them the opportunity to cause disease. So they are not obligate pathogens. They are present almost all of the time. E. coli is another example. It only causes disease in those situations where it's given the opportunity to cause disease. They're opportunistic pathogens. How we approach antibiotic administrations is very different for those than if you were infected with tuberculosis. Again, the model for TB does not work, which, as I'm going to show, means that these low doses of antibiotics, whether they be the feed, growth promotion, feed efficiency, or disease prevention doses, may not present the risk that others would like us to believe that they do. Here's a situation that is probably a little more realistic. Okay, this schematic is a little complex, but let's look at two individuals that are harboring susceptible bacteria. This could be an E. coli strain. It could be whatever is present normally within that individual. One is treated with an antibiotic, which works. Guess what? This administration worked, and we eradicated the bacterium that was present. But guess what happens when you do that? When you give an antibiotic, are you targeting only the single bacterium that you think you're targeting? No, you affect everything in that host. Its entire GI tract may be wiped out, all the bacteria in its GI tract because of the use of that antibiotic. What does that do? It puts that individual at risk for acquiring new bacteria that may be resistant to antibiotics. If you look in the literature, what's the biggest risk factor for acquiring an antibiotic-resistant infection? Prior use of antibiotics always is a major risk factor. Why? Because you have completely wiped out the normal bacteria that are within you, and now you put yourself at risk. I mean, we've known this in veterinary medicine for a while. We go through and we do things like, in cows, we'll transfaunate a cow. Right? We're moving bacteria and all the other organisms from a healthy cow to a sick cow. Why? To help repopulate the normal bacteria of the gut of that individual, protecting it from other infections. But in the individual that gets no treatment, there has been no change to the normal bacteria. And so it is more protected against other exposures that it's going to see in the herd. So the point is that what we don't want is to be using antibiotics at doses high enough to completely wipe out their normal bacterial flora. If you do that, you put the individual at risk. And I think what will come up in this talk and in the next one is that it's the low doses of antibiotics, which we know still work, growth promotion, feed efficiency doses, that protect the gut of the individual. And by protecting the gut of the individual, you put that animal in a healthier place. It can use its feed more efficiently, sure, but it also is protected against disease because of a stable bacterial population in its gut. All right? And that's just the lead-in to Scott's talk in the second piece. Is that what we're talking about then? Is that what those who want to ban antibiotics are actually talking about? Are they saying, but I believe that those low doses are, do they have proof that the low doses of antibiotics are causing resistance? And they'll say, yes, here's an example right here. Look at this paper out of Denmark where individuals were getting sick with salmonella, this Typhimurium DT104 strain that was multi-drug resistant, and some people even died. There was at least one mortality associated with this strain. And it was resistant to fluoroquinolones. And you know what? Fluoroquinolones are probably used in animal agriculture too, so this strain must have been caused, its resistance must have been caused by the use of antibiotics in animals. All right, this is a paper that many people will use as evidence that there is a risk associated with antibiotics in animals and that we need to get rid of the growth promotion doses. There's a bunch of problems with that argument, and you need to be aware of those. One is fluoroquinolones aren't used as growth promotion feed efficiency antibiotics. These are therapy only. Okay? This is the enrofloxacin, this is the Baytril example. And they are not being used in feed at low doses. They shouldn't be. This is a therapy drug. In fact, most of the papers that are used as evidence that animal antibiotic administrations are causing problems in humans are actually based on the high therapeutic doses. They're not based on the antibiotics that are used low dose in feed. You'd be hard-pressed to find some good papers that show that relationship between low doses in feed and human health risks. A second piece is if you actually read the paper, the Danes report that there was no indication of fluoroquinolone use in 1998 in the implicated swine herds. But the paper basically says that the fluoroquinolone resistance was due to the use of antibiotics in swine. I mean, this was what made the news. But they're admitting that they have no clue whether the antibiotic was ever used in those herds. And I guarantee you that if it were, Denmark would know. Based on their reporting systems, they probably would know. So there's huge problems with the way the literature is being used and, in my opinion, abused in support of banning antibiotics in animal agriculture. They just don't have the right argument. If you want to ban antibiotics at low doses in the feed of animals, show that link, that there actually is a human health risk, or just do it because you think that your marketability will be better. The general public just wants a product that's raised without antibiotics. That's fine. But don't try to use literature that's inappropriate as a justification for that ban. So let's just get to then a thought experiment here. Just play this game with me. Which antibiotic use is worse? This would be our little game show for the day. Which is worse for antibiotic resistance and for health? A long-term low dose, so you're going to put it in the feed at a low dose for an extended period of time, or the short-term high dose? Okay? Again, the dogma would say if you want to prevent the emergence of resistance, you need to give a very high dose over a short-term therapy. The therapeutic administrations are the only ones we should be using. Why? Because they give the least chance for the development of resistance. Unfortunately, that's not what the literature seems to suggest these days. In the work that we do in my lab and in some other labs around the world, what we actually see is that it's those high doses that select for resistance most strongly. So what do I mean by that? If resistance is already out there, some bacterium already has some multi-drug resistance and it's spreading around your farm or it's spreading around the community, the continued use of high doses are going to kill off all of the susceptible bacteria and are going to leave only the multi-drug resistant isolates. So it's the high doses that have the strongest pressure, impact on the bacterial population, and it's those high doses that present the greatest risk, in my opinion. Of course, it's very dependent on which antibiotic we're talking about, in which host, and against which bacteria. But in general, the high doses wipe out all of the susceptible bacteria and leave only the resistant ones. The low doses don't seem to do that. In fact, in some of our work, these low doses that are used for growth and for disease prevention don't even alter the normal bacterial flora at all. The susceptible bacteria do just fine in those low doses. The treated individual with those low doses has a very stable gut flora of bacteria that's comprised of susceptible, mostly susceptible and some resistant bacteria. It's not zero risk, but it has a much smaller impact on the bacterial population. As we probably most in this room know, antibiotics of various kinds were banned in Denmark in the late 90s. Basically what they were targeting were the antibiotics used for growth promotion and feed efficiency. What I was going to focus on in this talk is what happened to antibiotic resistance in Denmark following those bans, and what happened to the administration of antibiotics for therapy following those bans. Because the point of doing it was why? They wanted to improve health, human health particularly. So we should see some benefits associated with removing antibiotics from animal production in Denmark. Conveniently, what the Danes often do is they focus on their quote-unquote success stories, like Campylobacter coli in pigs, and here are the resistance trends from 99 to 08 against erythromycin, nalidixic acid, and tetracycline. And they all go down. So clearly there's a benefit to removing antibiotics from the growth promotion feed efficiency in Denmark because you can see reduced resistance in Campylobacter coli. Now, how many of us are really concerned about resistance levels in Campylobacter coli? How many human disease illnesses are we having in our hospitals due to Campylobacter coli? We should be looking at bacteria that are a little more important, I think. Like here is one of their charts, again, based in pigs and pork, and this is Salmonella typhimurium. I'd be a little more concerned about what's happening with resistance trends in a pathogen like Salmonella typhimurium. And if we look, like here in the pig populations, resistance against tetracycline, resistance against the sulfonamides, resistance against ampicillin, all have continued to increase post-ban of antibiotics in the feeds of animals in Denmark. You don't often hear that in the reports. But that holds for, in this case, there's many examples in the poultry production system, Campylobacter jejuni, which is a pathogen in poultry in Denmark. Resistance rates have continued to rise post-ban at the exact same rate they were rising prior to the ban. So it just begs the question, is their policy of removing the antibiotics from the feed actually having the benefit of reducing resistance levels like they had intended? And I would say no, and there's probably a good reason for that. And that's this. I call it this fallacy of antibiotic tonnage. How many times do we hear reports about how many tons of antibiotic gets used in animal production? It's a useless measure. It is absolutely useless. You cannot take tons or kilograms of antibiotic and lump all antibiotics together, all routes of administration in all animals, and say that that actually means something, that it allows you to predict anything. You can't lump all different antibiotics together, but that's what we often do. They report the total amount that gets used. And what we see in Denmark is if you look at their data, like these right here, they got rid of the antibiotics they were using in feed, the growth promotion feed efficiency uses. But actually, total antibiotic administration, when it's expressed actually as defined daily doses, how many doses of antibiotic are being administered, and in this graph it's per kilogram it's per kilogram of pork produced. The total amount of antibiotic has skyrocketed in Denmark if you measure it that way, in terms of doses. Why should we be measuring doses? Because tonnage doesn't mean anything. So they got rid of very low doses being used per animal, and instead what they're doing is dealing with a lot more sick animals, and so they're giving lots of high-dose therapeutic administrations of antibiotic. This is a classic graph. This just came out in 2010. What it shows are, in black would be your growth-promoting uses, and in this, whatever that is, gray, would be your therapeutic administrations. Here we see when they were basically starting to ban. Here's an avoparsin ban. Here's a ban on virginiamycin. Get rid of all the black, and guess what's happening? When measured again as the consumption, milligrams of antimicrobial per kilogram of pork produced, therapeutic administrations continue to rise in Denmark. Why? Because they are dealing with illnesses that were under control before the ban. they talk about this long period in here, 99 through 03, which they call an outbreak, a nationwide outbreak of Lawsonia intracellularis. An outbreak. Are there herds that you have that don't have Lawsonia at some point? I mean, I know we can have some free herds, but what does an outbreak mean? To me, it means that they no longer are able to control the disease in their population. Why? Because they had something in place that worked, namely the use of growth-promoting feed efficiency antibiotics. They took them out of the feed, and now they could no longer stabilize the gut of these pigs as they were growing. Now they're having to use therapeutic antibiotic to deal with this severe the ileitis that they were observing and continue to observe. They say that it was an artifact. We just had this outbreak for a while, but I don't know what an outbreak of Lawsonia means nationwide. To me, you change your policy, something that is working to control a disease, and you replace it with what? Having to treat sick animals. So again, it gets back to this question, one that I wish were out more in the public. Would you rather keep your animals healthy in the first place, or would you rather be using important antibiotics, antibiotics that are important to human health at high doses to treat sick animals that are then going to end up in the food supply? To me, prevention always makes more sense, but for some reason, we aren't getting that message out when it comes to antibiotics in animal agriculture. Part of the difficulty we have is how FDA is approaching antibiotic approvals and reapprovals of drugs that are used in animal agriculture. This is one of the documents that you have to use when you go through the application process. It's called their Guidance for Industry Document 152. And in it, they say that they consider the drug to be safe, okay, if it concludes that there is reasonable certainty of no harm to human health. Reasonable certainty of no harm. Okay, that's a classic toxicological definition that came out of some of the earlier risk assessments with respect to chemicals. How do you prove reasonable certainty of no harm when you're talking about an antibiotic administration that could lead to antibiotic resistance that may or may not end up causing slight increases in illness in hospitals? How do you assess reasonable certainty of no harm with antibiotics? It's incredibly difficult. If you use numbers like, well, we expect less than 1 in a million risk per person per year, FDA may or may not accept that as reasonable. I mean, it's totally up to them. This is a very subjective document. So we struggle to try to figure out how to convince FDA of a drug's safety or lack of risk based on this definition of reasonable certainty of no harm. And because of that, we also get stuck in this situation. You probably have no clue what you're looking at, this nice pretty picture. This is a plasmid within a bacterium. A plasmid is a large piece of DNA that bacteria harbor as sort of an accessory piece of DNA. So it contains a lot of genetic information that some of the bacteria might have, some don't. They can share these. And the point is this. These accessory elements, they usually don't need plasmids to survive. They bring other things with them like virulence, like antibiotic resistance. This is a plasmid. It's a very large plasmid that comes out of an E. coli. This is one that I isolated from a cow in Illinois. And the scary thing about these plasmids is that you can have all on the same genetic structure resistance to florfenicol, tetracycline, streptomycin, sulfonamides, extended spectrum cephalosporins, aminoglycosides, more sulfonamide, mercury, etc. All on the same unit. Can you think of what the implication of that is? Pick any one of those drugs, any one of them, and it will select for resistance to all of those drugs. How do you prove reasonable certainty of no harm? I know the drug I was going to pick is take a drug like florfenicol. No human analog. Should present very low risk to human health, if any risk to human health. And yet, if you use it, you may be selecting for resistance because of this plasmid to tetracycline, streptomycin, etc. Any one of those antibiotics that are present there can select for resistance to all of those antibiotics. So how do you now start to prove reasonable certainty of no harm? This is where it gets into a slippery slope. Are we going to start regulating on all of the potential that one antibiotic can have to resistance against everything else that's out there? And FDA still hasn't really decided how they're going to approach that. They They have some of that verbiage in their documents, but they haven't figured out yet what to do. But here's a key point for me, at least. We've looked at some of these plasmids in a variety of E. coli from a variety of animals in a variety of geographic locations. As an example, down here on the bottom would be represented by an E. coli that came from a cow in Illinois, an E. coli that came from a pig, and an E. coli that came from a chicken, all here within the U.S. Sorry, a turkey, all from the U.S. On the top is an E. coli plasmid that comes from a cow in Chile in a project where I work. And you know what? That they're identical. They're identical, except for a small piece that happens to harbor resistance to the extended spectrum third-generation cephalosporins like ceftiofur. All of these plasmids are identical. And you know what that means? There is no single antibiotic use. Like on this herd, they used that antibiotic, therefore resistance was created. These plasmids are global. These plasmids are identical. And you can find them in a whole variety of animal species. There is no single antibiotic administration that you're going to be able to identify that has caused this. Okay? What we're trying to do now is minimize the risk that this plasmid gets disseminated. We're trying to use antibiotics wisely so that we don't cause a situation where every bacterium has this multi-drug resistance scenario. But we need to get away from this idea, I know that we in this room probably have, that the way we're using antibiotics is causing these types of multi-drug resistance arrangements. And unfortunately, that's what we are still dealing with, is trying to, unfortunately, we're always on the defensive, but we're trying to argue that these genetic arrangements are old. I mean, we're talking, if you look at the evolutionary history of these are millennia old. These plasmids are everywhere. You can find this exact plasmid in Vibrio, Salmonella, E. coli, you name it. A whole variety of bacterium harbor the exact same plasmid. There is no antibiotic on a single farm that created this. But if you take them away, you got to use something, right? So this is what I'm going to finish with. Alternatives. This was sort of a classic example, and it brings us back to, again, an organism that has human health relevance. The methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, MRSA. Everyone's concerned about them. Now there's the clonal complex 398 or ST398 identified in swine production, so clearly something going on with pigs must be the reason why MRSA is affecting people. What they found was that a lot of these MRSAs of this type, this 398, were resistant to tetracycline. So the Danes proposed it must be the use of the chlortetracycline in the feed. And so they went about doing a variety of studies to prove that. Interestingly, what actually seems to be the case is when they looked, they found no difference in susceptibility to erythromycin, penicillin, or tetracycline in either the methicillin-resistant Staph aureus versus the methicillin-susceptible Staph aureus. They all were tetracycline resistant. Tetracycline resistance was not a feature unique to the MRSAs. They all had it. What they actually found, the MRSAs had resistance to zinc. I showed you that plasmid where there was resistance to mercury on it. Metal resistance is becoming a very common thing. You can find resistance to copper used in disinfectants. It might be selecting for antibiotic resistance. Mercury, silver, and in this case, zinc. What happened in Denmark? Well, they had to replace some of their antibiotics with other things. One thing they replaced it with was zinc oxide. They've also got zinc chloride. They've got a variety of zinc-based compounds they're using, which probably were actually causing the selection of MRSAs on their farms. Had nothing to do with tetracycline. So we have the unintended consequence of banning an antibiotic, think we're going to improve the situation, and in fact it's what you replace it with that causes even larger problems. I guess I had one more final piece. This is a piece that I think is not going to go away. We really need to be concerned about what's going on in the environment, how we manage waste. Are antibiotics from our production facilities getting into the waterways? We know there's been USGS surveys and others where they find low doses of antibiotics in the water. Our group had the question, just does there seem to be a relationship between the low doses you can find in water and resistance? I'll just go through this really quickly. When we looked at chlortetracycline at various doses, there seemed to be no effect of low doses of chlortetracycline, like the doses you'd find in rivers through those surveys, on resistant bacteria. Tetracycline at high doses did select for bacteria that were resistant to tetracycline in the water. Does that mean that we shouldn't be at all concerned? No, because when we looked at tylosin, tylosin does seem to have a dose response, that the selection for resistance is stronger at higher doses. But even the low doses did select for some resistance. My point for that is that I think we do need to pay attention to how we manage our waste, how we look at runoff, and how we look at the water that is around our facilities. That is an issue that I think will be relevant and continue to be relevant in the future. So take-home messages from my talk. First, we need to stop being defensive all the time and insisting on maintaining the status quo. I know that many of you in this room are probably looking at alternatives to antibiotic administrations. We need to be more proactive on those approaches. Are there things we can do in management, for instance, that might reduce some of the need we have for antibiotic administrations? Can you change your weaning age? Could you increase it slightly so that you don't have the problems around that age at weaning? Even increasing it 2 to 3 days might make a huge difference. Stocking densities. I know I'm working in the poultry sector looking at ways how stocking density might impact slightly their incidence of disease and their need for antibiotics. In Denmark, they've gone to a prescription only by veterinarians for antibiotic administrations. Should we be looking at something like that for how we distribute antibiotics? Should we be getting rid of over-the-counter administrations? This country's not set up for that kind of a system, but we do need to think about it and how are we going to address this issue of how antibiotics are administered on farms. And finally, like I said, I don't think these environmental concerns are going to go away. I don't know that they should go away. We need to be cognizant of how we manage waste on our farms and deal then with what these environmental pressures are from our